Between 1882 and 1968, there were over 4,700 lynchings in the U.S., and the majority of the victims were Black. And since the FBI began publishing data on hate crimes in 1995, African Americans remain the single group most frequently targeted for hate. How are we fighting back? We successfully disrupted online platforms that promote hate and racial violence, shutting down and obstructing some of the largest hate sites online. We advocated for Facebook to abandon its ill-conceived policy under which they banned white supremacist activity but permitted white nationalist and white separatist activity, because we know these racist ideologies are indistinguishable and equally dangerous. We're working with and pushing the tech sector to reform their policies to ensure that they're not providing a breeding ground for violent white supremacists, and we've partnered with the International Association of Chiefs of Police to strengthen law enforcement's response to hate as well. And we're also holding white supremacists accountable through the courts. Last year, we filed suit on behalf of a young African-American woman elected to serve as student president on her campus at American University. Following her election, she was subject to racist trolling. She was doxxed with all of her personal information published online. Bananas and nooses were hung on campus, including messages describing her as a gorilla. We secured a strong settlement last December with one of the defendants. But we can't do this work alone. We need our government to do its part. But today's national climate only fuels the fire. From the use of a racist expletive to describe African and Caribbean nations and much more, this administration's policies and rhetoric promotes animus against Black and brown communities. We also see an FBI diverting resources to investigate so-called Black identity extremism, all at the expense of combating real hate. Thus, it's not surprising that we're seeing an increase in reported hate crimes today. Corrosive white supremacist movements are tearing away at the fabric of our nation. And without question, they are using online platforms to recruit new members, activate followers, target communities, organize rallies, stream their murders, and incite violence. Instead of hiding under hoods, they now organize behind computer screens. They've sought to rebrand themselves, employing new labels to try and become more palatable to broader audiences. But regardless of what you call them, the alt-right, neo-Nazis, the KKK, Proud Boys, all pose the same threat today. What must we do now? As we continue to use aggressive lawyering strategies to move towards a society that's true to its democratic ideals, we call on all communities to help tear down the structures that facilitate violent white supremacy in our country. The banks that facilitate commercial transactions, the tech companies that provide open platforms, the web hosts that prop up these sites are all part of an infrastructure that feeds hate that must be dismantled. Congress must study and consider new laws for combating this online threat, and the federal government must abandon policies that fuel hate. At the Lawyers Committee, we're inspired by the strength and courage of survivors, and will continue to fight for a world in which no one is forced to endure such immeasurable pain. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll begin the questioning by yielding myself 5 minutes. Ms. Hirshinoff, are we or anybody else manipulating statistics to increase the apparent prevalence of white nationalist hate crimes, as was stated by one of the witnesses?
No, Mr. Chairman. The ADL is data-driven, and we have defined, and in the report submitted to you, we go through the details of right-wing extremism. Right-wing extremism last year was responsible for all but one of the 50 domestic extremist murders. We have submitted details about that. So that is 98%, 78% are white supremacy. One of the witnesses talked about the global attitudes that we look at. That's nonviolent looking at attitudes, and the ADL does track that. we feel it is incumbent, vulnerable, marginalized communities have bigotry within them. It is incumbent first for the members of those communities to call it out. There are members of the Jewish committee that are bigoted, that are Islamophobic, and my community needs to call that out, just as other communities need to. But we, again, are data-driven. If you look at the trends, we have the FBI with 17% increase in hate crimes overall. We have the third highest year last year of anti-Muslim hate crimes. We have, as Ms. Patterson and others said, a huge increase in race crimes and incidents. So this is the data that is there. And the report that we released today shows that there was an increase, a doubling, 100% doubling of anti-Semitic slurs and content on the channels that the murderer, Bowers, in Pittsburgh, and the murderer in New Zealand looked at, and Gavin 8chan, and a huge increase in racism since the 2016 election. I am not saying that anybody, one person, one elected official caused that, but there are corollaries there that we need to understand and we need to look at. We need to look at the data.
Thank you. Ms. Clark, white supremacist violence is on the rise. A 2017 report by the Government Accountability Office found that violence from the far right has actually accounted for 73% of deadly attacks since 9/11. Last week, the FBI urged that white supremacy is a, quote, persistent and pervasive threat, unquote. Yet the administration's response has been to rescind grants and ask Congress to eliminate DOJ's Community Relations Service, dedicated toward hate crimes, and which is dedicated toward preventing hate crimes and combating racial tensions. And DOJ has prosecuted hate crimes at a 20% decrease, despite acknowledging the rise in such crimes. What is your organization doing to ensure that there is an appropriate enforcement against these types of hate crimes?
You know, I was a former federal prosecutor in the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division prosecuting hate crimes, and I know that this Justice Department has unique tools in its arsenal and the expertise to do more to combat hate crimes. They should be stepping in and providing support to local law enforcement around the country when these hate incidents happen. There are churches burning in Louisiana. We need the government to step up and do more. We also need the FBI to do a better job incentivizing local law enforcement agencies to turn over the data so we can capture the hot spots where hate crimes are happening around the country. And then finally, we need to see this Justice Department using its bully pulpit more often to condemn hate when it happens. As a civil rights organization, we're deeply disturbed by the Justice Department and this Attorney General and prior AGs prior to him. We're disturbed by their deafening silence in the fake of hate incidents that we've seen across the country. We're going to continue to bring pressure to bear to ensure that they do more and encourage Congress to use its oversight authority here as well. The final thing that I'll note is that we're deeply concerned about the FBI's Black Identity Extremist designation. This is mere distraction from the very real threat of white supremacy that we face today.
Why is that distraction? Why is that a distraction?
Because it is not real. It is not a real threat. It harkens back to the dark days of our federal government abusing its power to go after civil rights activists during the heyday of the civil rights movement. There is no such thing as Black identity extremism. Again, this is mere distraction to take the public's attention and the government's resources away from white supremacy and white nationalism, which are the real threats that we're up against today.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Potts, I have a question. Just curious, where were you at in Iraq?
Remember, I was with General Mattis in the invasion of Iraq, so up through Safwan, to Al Nazariya, up through Baghdad, retrograded out, and pulled back to go to law school.
Good idea. I was in Milan, so I was just curious on what if we travel some of the same sands.
Right.
But interesting. I want to go into this, and look, I think there's interesting points made by all. I think one of the biggest distractions as we get is going back to what I said originally. Anybody who traffics in hate is bad and wrong and needs to be called out and needs to stop. I don't care what side you're on, left, right, or in the middle. Let's quit and get back to the issues that we're dealing with every day. And much of this has to do with the fact that there's a desire for publicity. There's the 15 minutes of fame issue here of those who are evil enough to go and do this. And one of the things we just saw recently was the live stream of some of this is now as the technology has progressed. This is something I'm curious about here because in your testimony, your written testimony, you talked about the viral videos and the ability to recognize and spliced or edited content and other things like that. Where are we heading to cut this off earlier with AI is important, but also there is a human element to this as well, which also leads into other issues not in this hearing that I'm sure will come up at other hearings, but I just want to see more on that issue right now.
Thank you, Ranking Member. That's a great question. As we try to combat any type of hate, whether it's terrorism, hate organizations, even hate speech to some level, we really try to combat that through a three-pronged approach. We look at those three prongs would be the product, our people, and then our partnerships. So first on the product, that's the AI. We have made significant investments in artificial intelligence to try to detect this type of content before it is seen, before it is reported, so that we can act more swiftly to remove it. We have made some significant progress. There's still a lot of room to go, but the investment over the next few years going forward, I think we can still see great gains to be made. Secondly is the people, and at Facebook we have over 30,000 people now focused on safety and security. That's subject matter experts, former prosecutors, former law enforcement officers, former intelligence officers like myself, ground intelligence officer, others that write the policies and help with the process. We have content moderators that focus on this and build out those processes, and of course the engineers that write the code for the AI. And then the third prong, and a very important prong, is the work that we do with our partnerships. We work throughout industry. I work with our colleagues at Google, Microsoft, elsewhere on things like the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism. When we are able to share, Ms. Walden spoke of hash sharing and digital fingerprints. When we're able to share videos that are violating across the industry, we're able to act more quickly. We also work with many of our external with civil society, NGOs, and academics to get ahead of trends. Of course, working with the government as well.
And I appreciate that, and I think one of the concerns that we come into, and especially when you get into, and you said hate speech, other things, is what is the definition of hate speech in regards to, the person of the actual human actually translating. For some that might be someone who is pro-life, maybe hate speech to someone who's pro, and there's issues there, but when we come to this nationalism, this is an issue that we are, I think, addressing. I do want to go back to Ms. Owens for a second. You made a statement at the very beginning on why you were here, and I think the victim of if you've heard your story, and you've told that story many times, but if you would share how that's affected your view as you go forward and the issues that you're wanting to address today.
Certainly. So when I was speaking about different classifications of hate crimes, which actually has increased and obviously impacts statistics, when I was in high school, I received a slew of messages from the Democrat governor of Connecticut's son, Mr. Daniel Malloy, and at the time he was the mayor of Stamford, and his son, along with 3 other boys, referred to me as the N-word, threatened to tar and feather my family and put a bullet in the back of my head like they did to Martin Luther King. This is a story that's not often spoken about because the media has no interest in telling the truth about how it's formed my views towards conservatism. The media turned it into a firestorm, and it became a political tool for people to gain power. The NAACP used me at that time, would just meet me outside of the school with cameras in tow to speak out against the crimes. Of course, now I'm older, and I realize that that's really just a fundraising mechanism, and that a lot of these groups survive because they cannot have the problem fixed, ever. The NAACP never wants racism to go away. Bottom line, all I was looking for at that time was an apology. The youngest person in that car was 14 years old, and I understand that human beings can make mistakes and do stupid things, but we're not in a society anymore where an apology is good enough, and we're obsessed with labels. We're obsessed with labeling people as racist, as they did to those young boys, and it simultaneously impacted me as a victim. It's not fun to be a victim, and I'm adamantly against victimhood, and I speak out to the Black community about how it ultimately harms us.
And I appreciate Anthony for sharing that. And I think as we go forward, as I started my testimony with, is all of us here need to be heard. This is exactly what we're advocating. The more we hear, the more we can then at least relate to those who we may disagree or agree with. And I thank you for being a part, and to the rest. For that, I yield back.
The gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Chairman and Ranking Member, let me thank you so very much for this hearing, and let me acknowledge each and every one of the witnesses. Your viewpoints are crucial to us. We are fact finders with our own personal emotions, but we are grateful for your testimony. I want to, my time is short, so forgive me if I pointedly ask for abbreviated answers. Let me say that coming from Texas, I must take note of James Baird, which as a member of the United States Congress and this committee provoked and generated the original hate crimes that was passed in the 1990s or early 2000s. James Baird was dragged through the streets of Jasper, Texas, decapitated, African-American male, minding his own business. In the late evening, I think he was found by either 2 or 3 white males. And that was almost 20 years ago. I give to his family my deepest sympathy, as well as I give to our courageous witness who has come to speak of his children in a horrible and horrific crime. And so today I want to say that I abhor racism and the stereotypes of African Americans, abhor anti-Semitism, I abhor anti-Muslim views, anti-immigrant views, anti-LGBTQ views, anti-Asian and Latino, and any other hatred, religion or otherwise, that plagues this nation. Let me ask the representative from the ADL, first of all, is hatred or is racism a reality?
Absolutely, Congresswoman.
And is a major target of white nationalists African Americans?
Yes, the core ideology of white nationalists, which is a euphemism for white supremacists, there are different types, but the core ideology is the belief in the imminent extinction of the white race because of a flood of non-white people and other people that they feel are degenerate, all orchestrated, puppeteered by Jews. You see that
May I
with ours.
continue with Dr. Abdul Salha, and again, let me prayerfully offer sympathy for that unspeakable tragedy. But my brief question to you, sympathy to your family, is did you teach your children, your daughters, hatred?
Absolutely not, Congresswoman. I actually taught my children our faith on every Sunday afternoon for 3 years and a half. And that is why they were all loving and caring, and they were cooking and distributing food downtown to non-Muslim people. I also sit on the board of my mosque, and we definitely make sure that anybody
So
who's racist or hateful is out.
by the very fact of being Muslim, you are not you are not filling children or those in the mosque with hatefulness.
Absolutely.
Miss-
We fight this, actually.
Ms. Patterson, let me just briefly thank you, sir, and forgive me for my time. Let me just thank you. You had a very provocative opening. There was some reference to reparations. I have introduced H.R. 40, which I take very seriously, a commission to study the heinousness of slavery. But you mentioned, if you would just very quickly just say it again, Mr. Thomas Jefferson's assessment of slaves. Could you just say that again for the record?
Intellectually inferior. We are unattractive physically, and let me